As we go through the third chapter of Gittin, we're dealing with practical questions about, well, what might happen if a document gets lost or the sender gets ill, or maybe even the sender isn't alive anymore. Practical questions relating to the bill of divorce, to the get. And then theoretical questions about, well, okay, what assumptions do we make in law that, people are still alive or documents are the right documents? And we've seen that the Mishnah flip-flops between the two types of questions. And as we close the chapter, and we're going to close the chapter today, we're going to get back to these questions of existential uncertainty. Does a person exist or does an object exist? But we'll see if we just think back through the Mishnayot that we've learned earlier in the chapter, we can see that this basic question, is a person still there or is a document still there? These two questions just run right through the chapter, regardless of whether we're talking about a bill of divorce, a get, or some other object. Let's jump into the Mishnah and everything will become clear. So in this case, the Mishnah is not going to talk about a bill of divorce, but it's going to talk about truma and maaser, about truma and tithes, which are due to be given to a priest, a kohen, or a levi, or maybe a poor man if it's maaser ani. So this property is due to be handed over, but it hasn't been handed over yet. It's been put in store. So we need to think, well, does it exist? Hamalveh ma'ot et kohen. Someone who lends money to a priest. V'et levi v'et ani. Or to a Levi or to a poor man. So in this case, before we separate off the produce, we're going to lend money to one of the categories of people who is entitled to receive this holy produce. If a person lends money to a priest or a Levi or a poor man. Mafrish, and the assumption is that we're lending on condition that this debt is going to be paid off with the eventual tithes, which are going to be given to the priest in the future. So we're going to lend to the Kohen or the Levi or the poor man on the assumption that we're going to pay off the debt later when we really deliver the tithes. It's a bit like paying forward. We're going to pay our dues forward. So we're going to do this. On condition that he can separate the tithes from his portion, i.e., he can repay the loan from the tithes. How does it work? Mafrish alehen becheskat shehen kayamin. He can do so on the assumption that they are still alive. In other words, this works on the assumption that these individuals he's lent to are still alive. How's he gonna do this? Well, when the Mishnah says mafrish alehen mechalkan, the person giving the tithes, well, when the time comes to separate his produce, clearly he can't just eat that produce on the basis that he's lent money to the Kohen, because the produce is holy. Absolutely, the produce is holy. But given that he's lent the money to the Kohen, he can actually turn his truma, he can turn his offering into money. So he, for example, could go to another Kohen, someone who has money, he could sell him the truma, get money for it. He could convert his truma into money, and in this way he's repaid his loan is repaid. His loan is repaid by handing over his real truma at the right time. He can't eat his truma, but he can hand it over and change it for money. But of course, when he's doing this, he needs to be certain that the original Kohen who received the loan is still alive, right? In other words, if that loan is no longer kind of valid, then the process, he can't sell the truma to a third party. So that's why the Mishnah says, Mafrish alehen b'cheskat shehen kayamin. He can do this kind of conversion trick with another Kohen on the assumption that the first Kohen who received the loan is still alive. He doesn't have to worry that the Kohen is dead, or Levi, or the Levi is dead. Or if we're talking about tithes for the poor, maybe the person in question is a poor man. Or Shema He'ashir, or Shema Heshir He'ani. Maybe the poor man got rich. Maybe the poor man's no longer a poor man. We don't have to worry about it. If we've made the loan, the person is in his state, we assume the state continues. Metu, Sarich Litol Rashut min Yorshim. If they died, if the borrower died, the lender has to receive permission from the heirs, because maybe the heirs would rather just repay the loan straight. Maybe the heirs don't want to repay the loan via this complex exchange. Ve'im hilvan bifnei beit din eino tzarich litol reshut. If he made the loan in front of a beit din, if he made the loan in front of a court, he doesn't need to obtain permission from the heirs. Somehow the court has got the ability to make the tribe of Levi, or the group of Kohanim, responsible as a whole for this debt. So further permission is not needed. Really interesting. So we do have certainty that the individual has died, and somehow the Bet Din is able to step in and re-establish order. Just as we saw, by the way, in the case of the messenger holding the get, who comes from abroad and somehow is taken ill. He can't carry out his function, but he can go to the court and the court can appoint someone else to carry out his function. The court can step in and establish order. That's one of the themes running through this chapter, and we'll see it come back in later. We'll absolutely see it come back in the next chapter. Let's go on. Let's deal with the existential uncertainty in the object rather than in the person. Let's say a person sets aside produce in order to count it as truma and tithe. So in other words, he's got some produce. He needs to separate, let's say, 2% as truma. He's going to take it and put it in a place in his warehouse and say, okay, that's my truma. So it's sitting there. So he has separated it, but he hasn't yet given it to the Kohen. This pile of produce is in some limbo state. It's been designated, but it hasn't been handed over. Or maybe he's done this with money. Ma'ot liot mafrish alehen. Ma'aser sheni. Maybe he's set aside money for the second time. Does it work? Mafrish alehen b'cheskat shehen kayamin. He can continue to count it on the assumption they still exist. On the assumption that is the produce still exists. Clearly, what if the warehouse was invaded by rats? The rats would eat the produce. Or if the money was stolen, the money might not exist. The produce might not exist. We kind of assume the produce exists. Obviously, if we know the produce doesn't exist, then we have to replace it because it hasn't yet been handed over to the Kohen or to the poor man. It's in this limbo state. It's been designated but not handed over. But while it's in this limbo state, we assume it exists until we have proof it doesn't exist. Of course, the proof might come along as the Mishnah continues. Ve'im avdu, if they are lost, if something goes wrong with this material, he must be concerned. Well, the Mishnah says me'et le'et, from time period to time period. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. This actually means for 24 hours. So for 24 hours, for 24 hours of harvesting, we can assume that truma or maaser wasn't taken. He's got to redo it. Rabbi Yehuda, which is not, that's not an enormous fine to have to go back 24 hours. Rabbi Yehuda is going to have a different view. Rabbi Yehuda omer bishlosha prachim bodkin et hayayin. Rabbi Yudah says on 3 seasons they check the wine. So now we're talking about someone who set aside wine. It's not produce, it's wine. It's not money, it's wine. And of course, wine can go bad. I mean, wine is a complex organism. It's got yeast in it. I mean, today, of course, things are very highly controlled, but in the time of the Mishnah, the whole winemaking process was much, much less highly controlled, probably using wild yeasts. Sometimes it would go bad. Sometimes it would go bad. And then, of course, the truant doesn't exist anymore. So how often do we check the wine? How often do we check it hasn't gone bad? I mean, clearly we're not going to check it every day. So Rabbi Yudah says, Rabbi Yudah Omer, Vishlosha prakim bodkin et hayayin. And on 3 seasons, we're going to check the wine just to make sure it still exists. And by the way, this means that if it's gone off, we're going to have to go back in terms of our makeup right the way back to the beginning of to when we last checked it. But there are 3 seasons. But kadim shel motzei hechag, when the east wind blows after the chag. When the Mishnah talks about the chag, it's always talking about Sukkot. So we got an east wind blowing after Sukkot. That's the first time period. V'hotzat madar, when the flowers go out. I think that's when the flowers fall. It might be when they come out, but I think it's when they fall. Kahati says it's when they fall. Uv'sha'at knesat mayim laboser, and when the juice starts to form in the grapes, when the grapes start to get, full of liquid. So we can see 3 times through the agricultural year, at least through the agricultural year of the vineyard. In the autumn, when the wind blows, basically everything's finished at that point. Although the wine, of course, is in the vats. In the spring, when the flowers are falling and the grapes are just forming, and then in the summer when the juice begins to form actually in the grapes.